Hi, Ken. It's a real honor to have you on the call with me today.
Uh, Vishen, it's a pleasure and a real delight. I'm just grateful to be here.
Ken, you've had a profound impact on the lives of so many amazing, great individuals I know, including many of the individuals I work with. I see, and I'm speaking now for the benefit of the 20 to 40,000 people who might be dialed in on this call right
Right.
now. So one of the really remarkable things about Ken is how his work has influenced people I know who are hardcore atheists, people who refuse to believe that there was a spiritual realm. People, one of my friends, for example, he is a senior leader here at Mind Valley. He grew up in a fundamentalist religious upbringing. And as he got older, he decided that he wanted to completely shun religion. And so every time I would talk to him about the power of meditation or things such as intuition, he would scoff at these ideas. And then he happened to pick up one of Ken's books. It completely changed his life. Now he's on, in his own words, a beautiful spiritual path. And he said his life has completely changed. And it was actually him who introduced me to Ken. So I really thank you, Ken, for the profound impact you've had in the lives of many of my closest friends and how you've completely shaken up the entire paradigm of how they view the world.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. That's certainly one of the things that, as a writer, you hope you can do. You hope you can help people and bring some clarity, bring some understanding into their life. And every time you hear you've had a chance to do that, it makes it all worthwhile. So I thank you very, very much for that feedback.
So let me ask you this, Ken. You've written close to 25 books that have been translated into dozens of languages.
Yeah.
What keeps you up at night? What are you obsessed with right now? Every great person I know has a passion or an obsession that keeps them awake at night. What is it for you?
It's this extraordinary capacity for the unity of consciousness. One of the things that we notice in our world today is that it's fundamentally a fragmented world. It's partial, it's separated, it's siloed, it's isolated. Every discipline is off in its own corner. Very, very few people are trying to figure out how it all fits together. And yet, of course, clearly, this is a single universe with a single evolutionary unfolding. And according to the religious traditions, there's ultimately a single self, a single spirit. There's a oneness that we ought to be experiencing. There's a unity that we ought to be aware of. And instead, what are we aware of? Fragments, parts, broken pieces. Humanity is not whole, it's shattered. And we experience that shatteredness in all sorts of wicked problems, problems that refuse to be solved because we continue to approach them in piecemeal, fragmented, partial ways. And that is what keeps me up. Both the idea that this unity awareness is possible, and it is, versus the fact that it's not being shared. It's not happening. It's not out there. All this out there are broken fragments and shards. And so both of those, kind of the flip side of each other, are probably the main propelling interest that I have.
And during this call, will we be discussing any aspects of what you mean by unity consciousness?
Yes, absolutely. And specific examples of the different aspects of it and the various dimensions that need to be included. And of course, I'm going to try to do this in as simple and straightforward a way as possible. With any sorts of theories, you can get carried away and it can get very detailed and etc. But we're not going to try and do that. We're going to try and give just a very straightforward, simple explanation of this unity consciousness, ways that you can start to experience it, and what its fundamental ingredients are.
Beautiful. So here's what we'll be covering in this call. First, we're going to talk about the difference between religion and spirituality. Second, Ken is going to talk about how do you advance your spiritual awareness. Third, Ken will lay out for you a framework for understanding the future of spirituality. This is a really, really, really incredible idea. It's a model where he's going to share with you the ideas of waking up, growing up, and showing up. I think you're going to love this bit. Finally, Ken is going to answer the question, what happens when your spiritual awareness becomes embodied? What does that feel like and look like? And then we're going to give you a brief introduction to Ken's new program, which will be emerging on the Mind Valley Academy and will be available and live as soon as this webinar is over. So Ken, let's begin. Let's get started with number one.
Absolutely. The difference between religion and spirituality. It's quite common nowadays to hear people say, quote, I'm spiritual but not religious. In fact, an average of 20% of Americans agree with that phrase. And one poll showed that an astonishing 75% of millennials agreed with it. So something really important is going on here. And what it seems to be is basically that religious means institutionalized, dogmatic, fixed, and absolutistic belief systems, things that you have to believe in, and then you get to live in life eternal in some sort of heavenly abode. Whereas spiritual seems something much more like direct, immediate spiritual experience. And it doesn't have to look like traditional religious items, but could be things like flow states, states of unity consciousness, feelings of being one with everything in the universe, or feelings of being an all-embracing love and compassion, or even bliss and ecstatic feelings, so-called peak experiences, not just belief systems. Now, there's actually quite a bit of research that's been done on these differences. And they come down to the fact that there are two basic ways that human beings can develop and evolve. And this includes spiritually. So it means we have two types of spiritual awareness. Most people are not aware of this, so we'll want to be paying attention to this. But one is called growing up, and the other is called waking up. Humans can do both, but they're very, very different items. So we'll start with growing up. Now, growing up is simply, well, it's what it sounds like. It's the ways in which human beings go from being infantile and childish to grown, mature, and hopefully wise individuals. Now, what the research has shown here is that even though humans have several different types of intelligence, these are called multiple intelligences. They include things like cognitive intelligence, emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, musical intelligence, somatic intelligence, aesthetic intelligence, spiritual intelligence, and so on. You don't have to remember any of those. It's just an example of the number of intelligences that we have. Because what research has shown is that even though humans have all these different multiple intelligences, they all develop to the same basic 6 or so levels of development. 6 basic levels of growing up. And there are many different ways that we can name these different levels. A common way was introduced by Gene Gebser, who was a brilliant pioneering developmentalist. And these terms he called the archaic level. Now, these are the 6 basic levels again. The archaic level, and this is where humans first evolved from the great apes. And it's experienced in today's child about the first year of life. Then the magic level. This is things like voodoo, where you stick a needle in a doll representing a real person, and the real person is magically hurt. In today's child, this occurs between the ages of around 2 or 3 and is marked by fantasy thinking, magical thinking, word magic, and so on. Then the next stage is the mythic level. So at this stage, Moses really did part the Red Sea. Elijah rose straight to heaven in his chariot while still alive, and so on. It's sometimes called mythic literal stage because the myths are believed in a very literal way. Then there's the rational level. This is the scientific belief in God. Like a lot of people today see evolution as spirit in action. They see evolution as how God creates this manifest universe. And so that's a more rational approach to spirit. And then beyond that is what's called the pluralistic level. This is level 5. It's also referred to as postmodernism, since it came after the rational modern stage, and represents a multiculturalism, where all cultures have something important to say, and none of them are superior. And then finally, the integral level, which attempts to include all of those in an integrated or holistic system. The point is that the integral level understands that all of those stages of development occur. And if we want a full picture of human growing up, we have to include all those stages. So the point is that there are dozens of models of human growth and development, but all of them point to essentially the same basic 6 major levels of growth that all humans have available to them and through which all humans grow. And again, remember, this will come back to the meaning of spiritual and religious. So the point is, anytime you grow and develop in any of those multiple intelligences, you'll be going through one of those 6 basic levels. And you'll do so stage by stage by stage. Now, that's the sum total of the result of research of 100 years of modern Western developmental psychology. And they all came to this essential conclusion. So that's an important part of this first type of development that we have. Now, these levels can also be simplified. And I'll give you one very, very quick version because it's simple and easy to understand, and it's also important. And this example simply looks at a person's sense of identity. And this grows through 6 levels, but they're often shortened to just 4 simplified levels. Now, again, all of this has to do with spiritual and religious. So just hang in there a few more minutes and it'll become very clear, I'm sure.
And Ken, I just want to say something. And for those of you who are listening to this, know that all of this is laid out for you in the workbook. So if you feel that, and one of the unique things about Ken's style is, and it's a great thing, is that he teaches in terms of frameworks. So the diagrams that illustrate all of this are in the workbook, and it would help you follow through. But know that to answer such a deep question, such as the difference between religion and spirituality, you will need some grounding in the various frameworks and models that Ken is going to share with you. Ken, please go on.
Okay, so we're looking at a person's identity, and the first stage, the individual is what's called egocentric. And that means they're identified with just themselves. There's just a single organism and its wants and desires. But as that grows and develops, the person can expand their identity from just themselves to a group of individuals. They can identify with their family, their tribe, their clan, their nation, their political party, their specific religion, and so on. This is called the switch from egocentric to ethnocentric, from me to us. And then there's a yet higher stage of identity where the person goes from ethnocentric to world-centric, from us to all of us. A person at this stage is identified with all humans and tries to treat everybody fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. This is the source of the so-called universal rights of men and women. The idea that no matter what your religion, or your race, or your sex, or your beliefs, you have the same set of rights as any other human. And all humans are to be treated fairly and with equal opportunity. Now, as odd as this sounds, this is a fairly recent idea. It only came into existence around 300 years ago with the Western Enlightenment and things like the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights. But there's still, finally, a yet higher stage of identity. And that's where a person expands their identity from all humans to all living beings, to life itself, to the cosmos at large. This is called moving from world-centric to cosmocentric. And as far as we can tell, it's the highest stage of identity that exists so far. So that's growing up. And that is one of its two major ways that human beings have where they develop and evolve. It's basically the growth of our different types of multiple intelligences as they all move through these 6 or so, or these simple 4 or so levels of development. But the other way people grow is called waking up. And this is where things get really interesting. And this is especially important when it comes to spirituality and anything like an ultimate reality or absolute spirit. And waking up often involves a series of stages, just like growing up. But these are stages of direct, immediate, often mystical experience. And the great meditation systems around the world usually give around 5 major stages of waking up. This, of course, can vary, but 5 is a common average. The point here is that there's a whole spectrum of states of consciousness ranging from the smallest, densest, least inclusive state to an identity with the most inclusive state, an identity with ultimate reality itself, with pure spirit, with Godhead, with the ground of all being. The common 5 stages are said to include things like the states of waking, states of dreaming, and of deep dreamless sleep. Those 3 we're all pretty much aware of. And then 2 higher states, which involve spiritual realities and are called the stage of the witness or pure awareness, and then the ultimate stage, the stage of unity consciousness or non-duality, or the union of infinite and finite, what the Sufis call the supreme identity, the identity of the individual being with the ground of all being, with infinite spirit, a realization that I and God are ultimately one, and a direct experience of that unity, that oneness. Now, using these 2 major paths of development, we can start to see what spiritual and what religious really end up meaning. Because the typical religious dogma or beliefs come from the path of growing up. and a not very high level of that path either. Most of the typical forms of the world's religions come from the mythic level of growing up. And remember, the 6 major stages are archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, and integral. And myth here means the direct, literal sense. So somebody at this mythic, literal stage of spiritual intelligence will think, for example, that Moses really did part the Red Sea, that God really did rain down locusts on the Egyptians, that Christ really was born of a biological virgin, that Lao Tzu really was 900 years old when he was born, and so on. A mythic literal Christian thinks that everything in the Bible is absolutely and literally true. A mythic literal Muslim believes everything in the Quran is absolutely and literally true, and so on. But people who say that they are spiritual but not religious don't want those literal type of mythic belief systems. They want direct and immediate experience. They don't want to think about spirit. They want to experience spirit. They want to wake up to experience what's variously called enlightenment or awakening or metamorphosis or satori or moksha, the great liberation. They don't want to simply think about spirit using a spiritual intelligence. Although spiritual intelligence, especially at its higher stages, can be a very good thing. But they don't want to just think about spirit. They want to directly experience spirit here and now. They want their lives transformed, awakened, liberated, enlightened. They don't want to just grow up, though they don't have anything against that, but they want to wake up. They don't want to just believe in something that supposedly happened several thousand years ago. They want to wake up to a reality that's here and now, in the timeless present, the timeless now, and find themselves one with a reality that includes the entire cosmos. So they want things like real meditation, contemplation, centering prayer, true yoga, zazen, mindfulness, and so on. And not simply Sunday school and dogmatic beliefs and notions they're supposed to believe in, but have no real relationship to their actual lives right now. So they are indeed looking for ways to wake up. And that's a big change for a lot of people, especially in the West. Spiritual is to actually wake up, and religious is to think about spirit in old and dogmatic ways, usually mythic, literal, and having little to do with actual experience of spirit. And these are definitely important distinctions, and we're seeing them show up more and more.
Ken, that is one of the most profound and beautiful explanations of a very controversial question. So I really
Thank you.
appreciate how you've laid that out.
Excellent.
When I listened to your program, one of the implications this understanding had for me was the idea of how I raised my kids, the idea of how I structured my company, the idea of how I felt when I would read the newspapers in the morning and read about conflict or wars. So this model really reframed much of my understanding of the world, and I really appreciate that this lesson, this idea that you have helped shift into humanity. Now, when I listened to your program, the same program that's available in the Mind Valley Academy, you did mention one nuance which I thought was really interesting. You talked about different types of hierarchies and how this hierarchical system that you're speaking of
Yes.
is really a unique form of hierarchy. It's not
Yes.
it's not molecules saying they are better than atoms, but it's
Right.
an integral hierarchy. Could you tell us about that, please?
Sure. One of the problems when people first hear about things like these stages of development, where each stage is becoming higher and higher, they immediately think hierarchy. and then they think hierarchy is bad. Now, in fact, there are two types of hierarchy, and these are fully recognized in the literature. But one is indeed bad forms of hierarchy, and these are usually called dominator hierarchies. And in those, like a caste system or a mafioso system, La Cosa Nostra, criminal families, the higher you are in those hierarchies, the more people you oppress, the more people you're in control of, the more people you can hurt and repress and hold down. Those are bad, and we all agree those are bad. But then there's another type of hierarchy, and we see this hierarchy throughout all of nature, and these are referred to as growth hierarchies. So a simple one, that because we've all heard about it, is just the evolutionary sequence itself that goes from quarks to atoms to molecules to cells to organisms. Now, each one of those is a higher stage, but here each higher stage is more inclusive. It's not more exclusive, and it doesn't oppress, it includes. So atoms include quarks. They actually enfold them. They enwrap them. Molecules include atoms. They enfold them. They include them. Cells include molecules. So molecules don't hate atoms. Molecules don't oppress atoms. If anything, they love them. They include them. They take them forward. So growth hierarchies, with each higher stage in a growth hierarchy, you get more and more inclusive. And in a dominator hierarchy, you get more and more oppressive. So in our simple, all of our human growth hierarchies we're talking about are growth hierarchies. So even moving from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to cosmocentric, each one of those is bigger. Each one of those is more inclusive. Each one of those is more loving and caring. And finally, at cosmocentric, we're all inclusive, all loving, all caring. That's the best possible place we could be. So we have to keep those two different types of hierarchies in mind, or else we'll just throw out all of them. And that has been a horrible mistake. Individuals thinking that all hierarchies are bad ended up throwing out growth hierarchies. And that was a disaster. So we want to keep that in mind.
And I guess, Ken, what this means is that as humanity is shifting from, say ethnocentric to world-centric, it is
Yes.
not that we are looking down upon ethnocentric and saying that is wrong. It's simply that we're expanding our view and becoming more inclusive of the hierarchy that, for lack of a better word, came before us.
Exactly. And it actually means we include that, plus we add others.
So why do you think, you said earlier that 80% of millennials now relate to the question, I am spiritual but not religious, or the statement, I am spiritual but not religious.
Right.
What caused that massive shift in the last generation?
I think in part it's an increasing evolution of consciousness itself. We're seeing each generation coming in at a little bit higher level of growth hierarchy, a little bit more inclusive, a little bit more open to these types of things. And so that opens them to these forms of spirituality that aren't just, mythic narratives or belief systems or stories or things like that, but are direct experiences of wider and wider and bigger states of consciousness, of flow states, of peak experiences, of experiencing yourself being one with everything that's arising moment to moment. And the millennials are very open to this. If we think back in this country, even back to, say, 1950 and the early 1960s, we had no idea of waking up. You just didn't hear about enlightenment or awakening or metamorphosis or the great liberation. All you heard about was believe that this particular person is your savior, accept this person as your savior, then when you die, you'll live in heaven forever. That was it. That was our form of religion. And so it wasn't that liberating. It wasn't that exciting. It wasn't that compelling. And more importantly, it didn't change our consciousness. It just left us where we were and had us believe a different belief system, a different story.
So are you saying, Ken, that we must discard religious ideas, heaven, hell, sin, to advance spiritually?
Actually, what we're saying is these stages of development, everybody goes through them. So everybody is born at square one. Everybody will have to go through the magic stage. Everybody will then go through a mythic stage. Then everybody will go through a rational stage. And if they keep growing, into a pluralistic and integral stage. So we're not going to throw these out. They're appropriate for their particular stage of development. Individuals will still be going through a mythic stage of development. And so they'll still be believing in things like Moses parting the Red Sea and Christ born from a virgin and Lao Tzu being 900 years old and all of those myths. There's an actual period of development where human beings go through what's called a mythic stage. And they believe that myths are real. And this is common today in a child around 5, 6, 7 years old. But that's when they'll believe Santa Claus and they'll believe the tooth fairy and all of that. So we can't get rid of that. That's actually part of that stage. What we're saying is don't get stuck at that stage. Keep growing to higher stages of spiritual intelligence. Keep growing up to higher stages of spiritual intelligence, all the way into rational and pluralistic and eventually integral.
So are you saying then that someone who has a purely religious mindset, that means they literally believe that they were born a sinner, they literally believe that God will frown upon them if they say do not cover their hair in certain situations, are you saying that that person is trapped in an earlier stage and needs to grow up?
Exactly. And that's the problem. Many of the great religions were founded during the mythic period of human evolution. So all of them believed that the earth was flat. All of them believed that slavery was natural. Virtually all of them believed that women were inferior. And if a woman committed adultery, she was stoned to death. Those were all taken as real because that's the way the mythic level looks at the world. The problem is, because that's where they got their start, many of them are still stuck there. And then many people believe that, and so they get stuck at that level too. So they're not moving to higher levels of growing up in their spiritual intelligence. They're actually stuck at childish levels of spiritual intelligence. And that's what the problem is.
In terms of advancing our spiritual awareness,
Right.
what is the next step for that? How do we advance our spiritual awareness?
Sure. And so the first thing we want to remember when we talk about that is that there are these two major paths of spiritual development. One is the path of growing up, and one is the path of waking up. But when most people ask a question like this, they usually mean, how can we advance on the path of waking up? What can we do to increase our spiritual awareness? Not just how can we think about spirit differently. Although that can be important too. But once we realize that we're working with the path of waking up, of actually experiencing spirit directly, of increasing our spiritual awareness, then we can focus in on that. Because now we can go back to those 5 major stages of waking up that most of the great meditation systems, East and West, talk about. And we saw that most of us are already familiar with the first 3 of those states: the waking state, the dream state, and the deep dreamless state. But not many people have experienced the next 2 states, the pure witnessing or pure unity consciousness. So most forms of meditation start with getting us in a position of being able to directly experience the pure witness. And that means to simply witness the present now moment, either by doing things like concentrating on the breath, or repeating a word or mantra, or focusing on various chakra energy systems, and so on. And all those are based on one extremely important point. This witness, this true self, or real self, as it's also known, which is said to be one with spirit, this true self is something we already possess, and it's active right now. We already have this true self, this pure witness, one with spirit, and it's already fully functioning. That means 100% of it is present right now. And so let's go through that and see exactly where that is. The easiest way is to simply start by describing what you feel is yourself right now. Just give a simple description of who you are. You might say things like, I'm this old, I'm of this sex, this is my education, and I have these degrees. I'm in this particular relationship. I work at this job. I live in this town and country. I have these brothers and sisters. I like this kind of music and these kinds of movies, and so on and so on and so on. You can simply describe yourself. But notice that we really have 2 selves that are present here. One is the self that we just described, the self that we can see, that we can make an object, that we can talk about and describe. That's the seen self, the object self, the ego. But then there's also the self that's doing the seeing. Not the seen self, but the pure seer, the pure witness, the self that is aware of that smaller objective seen self. This pure self, this pure seer, cannot itself be seen any more than a tongue could taste itself or an eye could see itself. It's the seer, not something seen. And if you try to find this true self and you actually see something, that's just another object, another thing seen. It's not the true seer. So the witness, the pure seer, has an awareness of, I see that mountain, but I'm not that mountain. I have sensations, but I'm not those sensations. I have feelings, but I'm not those feelings. I have a body, but I'm not that body. I have thoughts, but I'm not those thoughts. I have a mind, but I'm not that mind. I am the pure witness, the pure I amness that is aware of all of that, that sees all of that, but cannot itself be seen. That self that you can see and describe, that small ego self, that's just a bunch of finite objects. It's not our real self, our true self. It's not a real self or seer because it can be seen. It's not even a real subject. It's just a bunch of objects. And we have made the horrible mistake of identifying with that small, finite, mortal, little self. As Patanjali, the founder of yoga, put it, quote, ignorance or non-enlightenment is the identification of the seer with the instruments of seeing. And that's what we've done. We have a colossal case of mistaken identity, where we have identified pure awareness with the contents of awareness. The pure seer was something that can be seen. And that is the problem, because the real self is free of all that. Its awareness is, I have sensations, but am not those sensations. I am free of them. I have feelings, but I'm not those feelings. I'm free of them. I have thoughts, but I'm not those thoughts. I'm free of them. And enlightenment is to no longer be the victim of life, but the witness of life. So that's where we want to start in advancing our awareness, in increasing our development, in waking up. And that's to realize that our real self is the pure seer, the true witness, which is experienced directly right now as a vast, open, empty, clear spaciousness, a vast, open freedom, which is an ever-present sense of I amness, of just pure being awareness, and not any particular object or item or thing. We witness all of those, and thus are free of all of them. Christ said, before Abraham was, I am. And that's exactly this pure, formless I amness, existing in the present, timeless now. And the witness always exists in this timeless now. Anytime you think of the past, that thought itself is just a present thought existing in the now moment. And when that past actually happened, it was a present now moment. Likewise, anytime you think of the future, that thought is just a present thought existing in this now moment. And when any future becomes real, it will also be just another now moment. The pure witness is only aware of this ongoing, ever-present, timeless now. So there's a famous Zen koan which says, show me your original face. Your original face means your real self, the true seer. Show me your original face, the face you had before your parents were born. Now they mean that literally. That's not symbolic or metaphoric or anything like that. Your real self existed before your parents were born. Why? Because it exists only in this timeless now. And that's the real meaning of eternity. It doesn't mean going on forever in time. It means existing timelessly in the timeless now. So Wittgenstein said, quote, if we take eternity to mean not everlasting temporal duration, but a moment without time, then eternal life belongs to those who live in the present, to those who live in the timeless now. And we saw that's all the pure witness does, reflects everything that is arising right now, moment to moment in the timeless now. So that's the first and major step we take in advancing our awareness, namely to move from a series of seen objects, finite little things and events that come, stay a while, torture us, and move on. Instead, move to the very source of that awareness, to pure witnessing awareness itself. It's correcting this huge case of mistaking identity, of identifying pure awareness, pure witnessing, which sees everything but does not judge it, condemn it, or identify with it. Just like a mirror mind, it allows all objects to come, to remain as they like, and move on, while it simply and effortlessly witnesses all of it. That's the first and most important big step in advancing our awareness. And that's identifying with awareness itself and not its contents. So there we go.
I see. Now it sounds like what you are saying is to move from growing up to waking up. What we want to practice are certain embodiment practices that help us understand our real self.
That's right. One of the first things that we want to do to advance consciousness is to realize that even though growing up is important, and we'll see why in just a second, but what's really important is waking up, is having this direct experience of our higher self, which is one with spirit. And those direct experiences are the core of waking up. So that's exactly what we want to do. We want to get off growing up, and especially if we got stuck at some level of growing up, like mythic literal, we really want to get off of that and on to the practice of waking up. And that, again, is what most forms of meditation do: contemplation, mindfulness, zazen, various forms of yoga, and so on. They help us yoke our individual awareness to this higher awareness, to this true self, to this pure spirit. And that's the first big step in advancing our awareness, is stepping in to those higher stages of waking up.
I see. Now you said that was the first big step, which makes me presume that there are further steps. And I know we may not have time to explore all the steps, but could you perhaps give us a framework for the future of spirituality? You spoke about waking up and growing up. What
And
about
showing up and cleaning up. Yes, exactly. Well, these are important because they cover really fundamental areas that a comprehensive spirituality should be dealing with. Unfortunately, very few of them all are. So all four of those dimensions are very important, but very few spiritual paths include them all. And that's a real shame, because all of those dimensions exist anyway. And if we're not aware of them, then we just get blindsided by them. They run us over. They have us. We don't have them. So I'll run through them very briefly and explain what they are. And by the way, the evidence for each of these dimensions is just overwhelming. The various knowledge communities that work with them have massive amounts of evidence showing that they do indeed exist and are very important. It's just that nobody has ever brought them all together into a single framework. So here they are. We've already looked at waking up. It's clearly the center of any true spirituality. It's how we actually contact and become aware of spirit itself. Unfortunately, many religions and spiritual systems don't have any real waking up component at all. They're just belief systems. Believe that this person is the one and only true Savior and you'll live in heaven forever, that sort of thing. But all of the great religions were founded by individuals who themselves had profound waking up experiences. Quote, Let this consciousness be in you, which was in Christ Jesus, that we all may be one. That's not a belief. That's a direct living experience of oneness, of true I amness. And that's the aim of every major spiritual system of waking up the world over. So waking up is core and will remain core, I believe. But it's important that we interpret this experience in as mature and grown a way as possible. After all, you can be at an ethnocentric level of growing up where you're identified with what you think is the one true God, or the one true race, or the one true political system, or the one true religion. And if you have a unity consciousness experience, it will just reinforce that ethnocentric belief. Many high-ranking Nazis, like Himmler, were very interested in mystical experiences of oneness. You can get a book called Zen at War, and it has some of the most respected Zen masters in history, and they're all expressing purely ethnocentric views. Why war is good, why their race is superior, and so on. The point is that growing up and waking up are indeed two very different processes. And you can be highly advanced in one and very poorly advanced in the other. Any future spirituality will definitely need to include and emphasize both of those paths, or we'll get some very partial and fragmented results. The ideal, of course, is to grow through both of those, to both the highest levels of growing up and the highest levels of waking up. Now, showing up means showing up for or including all three or so of the most basic human perspectives that there are. These are usually called first person, second person, and third person perspective. They're very simple. First person perspective is the person who's speaking. So right now, that's me. That's an I or a me. Second person is the person being spoken to. So that's a you or a thou. And third person is the person or thing being spoken about. So that's a him or a her or just it, just a plain old it. And the point about these three perspectives is that everything in existence can be looked at through all three of those perspectives. And all three of them are important. They all three give us a different kind of important truth. And this applies to spirit as well. So spirit can be looked at in third person as a big it, like let's say the great web of life. The great web of life is just spirit looked at through a third person perspective, looked at through the objective, exterior, third person view. Many people, particularly in the modern world, think of spirit as something like Gaia or an evolutionary great web of all life, with each of us being an equal strand in that great web. And that great web is evolving, and that force of evolution is spirit. So that's fine. That's third person view of spirit. That's the great web of life. Now, the second person view of spirit sees spirit as a great thou, as a great second person, as a living being, pure intelligence, or great other, but with whom humans can have a direct relationship, what Martin Buber famously called an I-thou relationship. The importance of the second person perspective is that it tells us that the great web of life is actually conscious and present and something you can directly interact with. And this is fine too. This great thou is spirit looked at through second person perspective. And of course, most of the theistic traditions only look at spirit through second person perspective. And our view is that all three of them are correct. So you don't want to get stuck at just one of them. So then there's spirit in first person. And that means spirit as your own highest I, your highest first person, your highest self, which we've already seen as the pure witness or true self. For some religions, especially the theistic, saying this is blasphemy. But it's just repeating the experience of the founders of the religion. Al-Halaj, Christ, Mohammed, Buddha, Shankara, all of them had the experience of their deepest awareness being directly one with divine spirit. And that's fine. That's spirit in first person. So you can see all three of those perspectives are real. They all exist. And they all need to be honored and included as part of this more integral framework. Yet there have been wars fought over which one of those perspectives is real. But for any truly integral or inclusive view, all of them are real. All of them are important, and all of them need to be included. This certainly applies to any adequate spiritual system. So that's showing up for all of reality by including all of the perspectives through which we can view that reality, including spirit. So showing up is just as important as growing up and waking up. For example, if you don't fully show up for spirituality, if you think spirit is just a second person great thou, or just a third person web of life, you won't even know about waking up, because waking up occurs only in the first person, only in awareness itself. So without that, there's no waking up. So you have to show up before you can wake up. So showing up is important. And finally, we also need to clean up. And that means to deal with all the unconscious and repressed and disowned shadow material that's an inevitable part of growing up itself. But starting even at birth, human beings begin denying and disowning aspects of their own being that are too uncomfortable or shameful or distressful or disallowed. We deny these aspects. We repress them. We push them into the unconscious. And from there, they enormously torture us, creating all sorts of neurotic and psychotic symptoms. The only way to cure these is to re-own and reintegrate our disowned shadow unconscious material. So, in other words, we need to integrate Freud and Buddha, or Freud and Christ. And although many spiritual systems have ways to deal with negative emotions, very few, if any, actually have ways of dealing with truly repressed emotions. Those repressed shadow elements follow rules all their own, and those have only really been discovered in the past few hundred years, long after most spiritual systems have already been created. And meditation itself will not cure repression, will not reintegrate the shadow. Just like growing up and waking up and showing up are all different, so cleaning up is different from any of those as well. Now, there are many different shadow work systems, most of which are quite effective. And so you only need to look around a little to find one that will work for you. But things like Gestalt therapy or transactional analysis or integral therapy can be quite effective. And it helps to have them as part of any spiritual path. We all know people who are fairly enlightened or quite good at meditation, but still have a lot of neurotic symptoms and problems. And that's because waking up will not necessarily help you with cleaning up. So those four dimensions, growing up, waking up, showing up, and cleaning up, are all equally important aspects for any truly comprehensive or inclusive spirituality or growth system. And we definitely want to include them all. Otherwise, we're simply training ourselves to be partial, to be fragmented, to be broken people, even while we think we are becoming more spiritual. So all of those are important.
Ken, that's a beautiful framework for understanding our own individual path for personal growth. I love what you just said. It also helps give me a framework for what I believe is my life work with Mind Valley Academy and Mind Valley, which is getting many of these models and programs and treatments from mindfulness to courses on clearing childhood blocks out to
Exactly.
people. So thank
Yep.
you for that. But I
Yep.
think I think one big question that those of us on this call who are listening in might be wondering is, what's the point of all of this? Why should we? Why can't we just live and be who we are? A human being, driving a car, watching television, reading a book, going to the 9 to 5, living in our cities. What happens when spiritual awareness becomes embodied? What's the point of all of this? Why should we care?
Well, exactly. I mean, a very quick, brief question. I'll go into it more seriously. But it's like saying, what good is it if we have a bank account with $1 billion in it? Why does it do us any good to actually discover that bank account? Well, a lot of things. A lot of good can be done with that. It's an enormous amount of potential. It's a greater and true capacity of our real condition. Why on earth would we not want to find out our true self, our ultimate condition, our real nature, ultimate reality? Why would we turn our backs on that? And so that's the important thing. Spirituality is the only discipline that includes what's called two truths. One truth is relative truth, like science, the relative truths of chemistry or biology or medicine. None of the mystical traditions deny those. Those are all important. But there's a second truth, not relative truth, but ultimate truth. None of the sciences deal with ultimate truth. None of the humanities deal with ultimate truth. Only spirituality deals with ultimate truth. Why wouldn't we want to know ultimate truth? So that's why it's so important. And of course, the best thing we want is the most effective spirituality. And that includes the most comprehensive, the most inclusive, the one that is growing up and waking up and showing up and cleaning up. That's the fundamental reason for us to engage in these practices at all. So let me say one other thing, too, because the whole notion of spiritual awareness embodied has a lot to do with the actual created universe, why it's there and what it is. In a sense, this is the definition of enlightenment, the union of emptiness and form, or the union of infinite and finite, or the union of heaven and earth, or the union of the divine and the human. It's spirit made flesh, this spiritual awareness embodied, or flesh itself, realizing that it's one with spirit. This is, for example, what was said of Jesus Christ, that he was one person with two natures. He was one person who was fully human and fully divine. And that's what awakening or enlightenment or liberation shows is true for each of us. That in this body, in this lifetime, we can realize the supreme identity. We can realize that we each are radically one with Spirit itself. And this does not mean, by the way, that we get rid of pain, but we do get rid of suffering. Because suffering is pain plus the ego. When we overcome ego by discovering our true self, then pain will still arise, but it no longer hurts. There's no separate ego to experience pain. There's just the pain itself arising like any other object, like clouds in the sky, or water rushing by in river, or music notes played by a band. They just arise, are reflected in the mirror mind of the pure witness, and then pass their way. But when we're no longer pushing at pain, or pulling at pain, or identifying with it, then there's no resistance to pain, and thus no suffering. There's just the pain itself, a simple energetic vibration like any other experience. But we're no longer a separate ego pushing or pulling at pain. We are the pure witness, simply witnessing pain as it arises, stays a bit, and passes. Always understanding that, quote, this too shall pass. And so pain is never converted to suffering when we're embodied spiritual awareness. The body will still hurt, but we won't suffer. So spiritual awareness is itself often called pure emptiness, or formless, or unmanifest, or unqualifiable. And that just means that it transcends or exists beyond any particular thing or event or form or body. And the whole manifest universe comes into being when formless spirit takes on form, when it takes on various bodies, or when emptiness itself takes on form. But when this first happens, the form usually identifies just with itself. It just identifies with a separate body, or a separate self, or a separate form, and forgets its background identity, forgets its background reality, namely spirit itself. So the paths of the great liberation around the world, that is, the paths of waking up, the paths of enlightenment, came into being primarily to help spiritual awareness and individual forms remember that they're one with emptiness, that they're one with spirit, that spiritual awareness has become embodied. And to remember that spirit is embodied is to wake up, to become enlightened. That is what the body is waking up to. It's waking up to spirit, to Godhead, to emptiness. Samsara is becoming one with nirvana. It's waking up. So the whole point is that this entire universe depends upon both emptiness in form, or spirit in body, or formless in form. Without spirit, there would be nothing that was creating form. There would be no source, no ground, no infinity. And so nothing would be created. And yet without created form, spirit would just remain in its unmanifest, uncreated state. Pure formless abyss. What Kabbalah calls ayin, nothingness. So this manifest universe is itself spiritual awareness embodied. And it's that union, that oneness of spirit and form, nirvana and samsara, emptiness and embodiment, spirit and body, that is the union that is remembered with enlightenment, with awakening. And it's an awakening to the true nature of this world, to the ultimate reality of this world, to its actual condition, a spiritual awareness embodied. And that realization is held to be the summum bonum, the greatest good that a human being can have. So that's something worth remembering, I guess you could say.
Thank you, Ken. That's a beautiful way of summing up the greatest
Thank you,
good
sir.
that a human being can have. That was definitely a really beautiful, eye-opening conversation, and I love how you bring in so many different disciplines and really lay out for us an entire framework for us to explore what is probably the greatest exploration we can do, which is the exploration of ourselves.
I certainly agree, and thank you very much for those kind words. It's my pleasure to be able to work with people like you that are also on the same path, have the same dedication, and have a similar goal and are working for the same thing, which really is a summum bonum. I mean, this really is a great good that we're working for humanity. And so it's a pleasure to meet with people like you and to interact with people like you and to share this path together. It's wonderful.
Thank you, Ken.